All right, let's jump right in. Today's deep dive is all about cracking the code of Spanish, but we're doing it in a slightly sneaky way.
Sneaky good, hopefully.
Exactly. We're dissecting a beginner's lesson, but not just any beginner's lesson. This one is designed for Spanish speakers learning English.
It's like reverse engineering the learning process. By analyzing how a language is taught, we can uncover those hidden mechanics, those aha moments that help us understand how it really works.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where does this linguistic deep dive begin?
Right at the beginning, with numbers.
Numbers. Sounds kind of basic.
You'd think so, right? But even here, there are these subtle but crucial differences in how English and Spanish speakers approach pronunciation. The lesson actually points these out, which I think is brilliant.
Oh, I see where you're going with this, like those pronunciation pitfalls that trip up every beginner.
Exactly. For example, the sound in three, Spanish speakers often struggle to get that sound right, and they tend to pronounce it closer to an F.
It's like a linguistic collision, and I bet the rolled R in cuatro gets them every time.
Every single time. It's almost a rite of passage for English speakers learning Spanish.
You're not kidding. But what I find really interesting is how the lesson seamlessly transitions from numbers to introductions.
Right. It seems like a big leap, but they connect it through the concept of this and that, like, this is Maria.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that reveal something deeper about Spanish?
Because it highlights a fundamental difference in how English and Spanish use pronouns. We were just talking about this is Maria. In English, we often drop subject pronouns, especially in casual conversation.
So we might say walking to the store instead of she is walking to the store.
Exactly. But in Spanish, you'd almost always include the pronoun. Ella está caminando a la tienda. It's subtle, but it makes a big difference in how the language is structured.
So it's like Spanish prioritizes clarity and a consistent structure, even if it means using a few more words.
I think that's a great way to put it. And it shows how even at this very basic level, we can start to appreciate these fundamental differences in how languages operate.
It's like we're already uncovering those hidden patterns, those subtle clues that reveal the inner workings of Spanish. And speaking of uncovering hidden patterns, things get even more interesting when the lesson delves into verbs.
Ah, yes, verbs. The engine of any language. And this lesson gives you a fantastic starting point, focusing on those essential present continuous verbs. Actions happening right now.
Give us the highlights. What kind of verbs are we talking about here?
Think of the verbs you'd use in everyday conversation. To talk, to speak, to listen, to look, to go, to come, even to sit and to stand.
It's like they're handing you the building blocks of basic communication.
Exactly. And they don't just throw these verbs at you in isolation. They provide context by using them in simple sentences like he is talking or she is listening.
Those might seem like baby sentences, but they're carefully designed to illustrate how these verbs function in a real conversational context. It's like they're giving you a blueprint for building your own Spanish sentences.
Exactly. And that's where the real learning happens. When you take those building blocks and start experimenting, creating your own sentences, making the language your own.
So we've covered numbers, introductions, those essential verbs. It seems like this lesson covers a lot of ground. There's one more thing I want to touch on before we move on. The subtle cultural cues woven into the language.
Ah, yes. This is where things get really fascinating. Even in a beginner lesson, we can start to uncover these layers of cultural understanding.
Absolutely. And one of the key examples here is the lesson's emphasis on using usted when addressing someone. They mention the informal tú, but they really stress that sense of respect and formality that's so ingrained in Spanish culture.
It's a really insightful observation. And it reminds us that language isn't just about grammar rules. It's a reflection of how a culture views social dynamics, those unspoken rules that govern how people interact with each other.
And that, my friend, is why I love these deep dives. You start with a seemingly simple lesson, and before you know it, you're uncovering these amazing cultural insights.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Each layer reveals something new and intriguing.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, so we've set the stage, explored some key concepts, and even gotten a taste of Spanish culture. Are you ready to dive even deeper?
Lead the way. I'm hooked.
As we've been unraveling this beginner Spanish lesson, it's really struck me how much we can learn about a culture just by examining its language.
Oh, absolutely. It's like language is a window into a culture's soul. It reveals how people think, how they see the world, how they interact with each other.
Exactly.
And it's not just about gender either. This difference in perspective, this attention to detail, it permeates so many aspects of the Spanish language and culture. From the way people express emotions to the way they tell stories, there's this richness, this depth that we can start to appreciate even from a beginner's lesson like this.
It's like we're already getting a glimpse into the soul of Spanish culture, even though we're just scratching the surface. But, okay, enough with the philosophical musings for a moment. Let's get practical. How can our listeners actually use these insights to improve their Spanish learning?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think the answer lies in one of the key takeaways from this lesson: the importance of practice, and more specifically, experimentation.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just passively absorb a language like you're soaking up the sun on the beach. You have to actively engage with it, wrestle with it, make it your own.
And that's what I love about this lesson. It subtly encourages that active learning process right from the get-go. Remember those example sentences they provided? Like, he is talking, she is listening.
Yeah, I was wondering where you were going with that. They seemed pretty basic, even for a beginner's lesson.
Precisely. But they're not just there to illustrate grammar rules, they're invitations.
Invitations?
Yeah.
To what? The Spanish Language Club.
Invitations to play, to experiment. The lesson wants you to take those basic sentence structures and run with them. Swap out verbs, try different nouns, even change the pronouns to see how it affects the meaning.
So it's like they're giving you a set of Legos and saying, go wild, build whatever you can imagine.
Exactly. And the more you experiment, the more those grammar rules and vocabulary words will start to click. They'll stop feeling like abstract concepts and start feeling like tools. Tools that you can use to build your own linguistic masterpieces.
It's so true. It's like learning to cook, right? You can read all the cookbooks in the world, but until you actually get in the kitchen and start chopping vegetables and mixing ingredients, you're not really cooking, you're just reading. Language learning is the same way. You have to get your hands dirty, make some mistakes, and experiment.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Embrace the mess. Don't be afraid to experiment. The more you play with the language, the more fluent and confident you'll become.
So, to sum it up, embrace those aha moments. Pay attention to the subtle cultural cues embedded in the language, and don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. But speaking of getting things wrong, there was something in this lesson that I found really clever. It actually anticipated some common mistakes that English speakers tend to make, like almost as if they'd been listening in on our struggles all along. Spill the beans. What kind of mistakes?
Well, one example that comes to mind is the pronunciation of V. We touched on this earlier with 5.
Ah, yes. That tricky V sound that can make or break your Spanish accent?
Exactly. The lesson points out that English speakers often pronounce V with a harder, more forceful sound, like a V. But in Spanish, it's much softer, almost like a gentle breeze.
It's those subtle differences, those nuances of pronunciation that can really trip you up, especially when you're first starting out. But what I find so clever is that the lesson doesn't just point out the error, it explains why English speakers tend to make it. It's all about the mechanics of how we produce sounds, the way our tongue and teeth work together. It's like they're giving you a backstage pass to the science of language.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it highlights another important aspect of language learning that often gets overlooked.
What's that?
It's not just about memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules. It's about developing an ear for the music of the language, the rhythm, the intonation, the subtle nuances of pronunciation that make it come alive.
It's like the difference between reading sheet music and actually hearing the music played by a live orchestra.
I love that analogy. And this lesson, in its own subtle way, encourages learners to start developing that musical ear, to really tune in to the sounds of Spanish.
So it's not just about what you say, but how you say it. It's about capturing that authentic Spanish flair.
Absolutely. And that, I think, brings us to the heart of what makes this beginner Spanish lesson so remarkable. It's not just about teaching you the basics of the language. It's about instilling a love for the language, a sense of wonder and curiosity about its intricacies and its beauty.
It's about sparking that desire to learn more, to delve deeper, to truly master this beautiful and complex language. And that, my friends, is the power of a good teacher, a good lesson, and a good deep dive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to all our listeners out there, no matter where you are in your language learning journey, keep exploring, keep experimenting, and most importantly, keep that sense of wonder alive.
Beautifully said. We'll catch you on our next deep dive, where we'll no doubt uncover even more hidden treasures in the world of language learning. Until then, happy learning.
Thank you for joining us today on English Learning Podcast. I want to congratulate you for taking the time to improve your English. Every step counts, so keep moving forward and don't stop. If you enjoyed this content and want to learn more, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button so we can keep creating videos like this. Let us know in the comments what level of English you're at and what topics you'd like us to cover in the next episode. Also, check out the links in the description for additional resources to help you keep advancing. See you in the next video. And remember, English Learning Podcast is here to help you reach your English goals. Keep learning.